In order to access the backend developer tool in Petscop, the player must utilize a hidden function in the sound test menu. However, in doing this, we can see what is likely the entire completed sound library that the game has. Here, each sound file is listed as either a music file or a sound effect file, and marked with the corresponding hexadecimal number. In all, converted to a decimal from 85 hexadecimal, we see that there are 133 different sound files. Not all of these files are named, however, and some come under the name of... My theory for why this is the case is that the player of the current file has yet to encounter the sound files in-game, and therefore they are not listed. I can't prove this is or isn't the case, but I will nonetheless use it as the explanation as to why the files are unknown. Anyway, now that Petscop has finished with the soundtrack being the last video, I endeavoured to try and name and identify as many sound files as possible, and place them on the list. The first thing I should point out is the sound effects in the Petscop soundtrack video are not listed with names, as opposed to the music. Also, the footstep sound effects don't appear on the list at all. However, disregarding the footsteps, if the sounds in the soundtrack are listened to in sequence, they are in the same order as the files listed in Petscop 17. I should also point out that the list you see here is the list from the progress document, which contains an amalgam of sounds from both the soundtrack and Petscop 17. This is the list I'll be adding to, not the Petscop 17 track list. Remember, there are 3 different sound effect sources that I'll be referencing: the soundtrack, Petscop 17, and the progress documents list. Secondly, these files seem to be grouped thematically, as in each file fits a certain theme or area of the game. What I mean is, the files preceding and or following the current file are related in terms of theme until that theme ends or a new theme has started. For example, from the list in Petscop 17, files 13 to 20 are all sound effects that relate to the game's menus, and within that they are subdivided into their own separate themes. This happens with every file on the list. So what can be placed onto the sound file list? I was making a distinction for each unknown number by categorizing them as one of 3 things: stuff that's not on the list but can be found, stuff that's not on the list and can't be found, and stuff that's on the list but hasn't been described. And from this, I've made some pretty interesting discoveries. Let's begin. Of the music files that are unknown, we can place 3 of them. If we are to look at the files in the soundtrack description as happening chronologically in order with the files in Petscop 17, then it would only make sense to have Music OF as sound file counselor and Music 12 as sound file bottom. But what of the sound file lost? It's not been placed on the list yet. The progress document has it presumed to be Music OA, which is named OOC in Petscop 17, but the document says that it's named Lost in the OST, so the names were changed for some reason. However, I'll be placing it here as music file OB for the time being. Remember it, I'll circle back as to why later. The rest of the unknown music files, 5 to 8, cannot be found. Now we move on to the first set of sound effects, determined by all the sound files we hear in the section SFX1 of the soundtrack. Most of the files are named and described apart from 2, and as the files are ordered the same way in both videos, we can determine where these 2 unknown sounds that we never heard of go. So they go here. But what are they and what can they be called? Remember how I said sound files are laid out in order of theme? Well, what was the theme of the previous sound files? From 22 to 27, they were pet cries, and then from 28 to 34, They are all sound effects that related to the pet's ambient noises, or their rooms, so the sounds we hear fit into this theme. Chronologically, it makes sense, and in terms of theme, they would either have to be noises made by a pet, or a noise that is happening in one of the rooms, like the treadmill noise. Initially, I thought these sounds were meant to be the unseen character Hudson, but because the player had never met him before, they're blank on the list. But then I remembered that Hudson wasn't real, he can't hurt me. Also, look at the context the file 2F is in. We see that it comes after 2 of Randus's sound effect files, sounds of Randus getting more and more thirsty. The thematic placing of the file makes it related to Randus, or at least the room Randus inhabits, so it must have something to do with him. Listen to the files in order. Obvious what's happening, right? Randus bonks, emerges, drops, then he gets thirsty. Very thirsty. Then... I theorise that if Randus isn't captured and left to wilt, Randus would die. This makes sound file 30 much more interesting, because now, in terms of theme, it's either related to Wavy somehow, or more likely, as it's undiscovered just like 2F, it implies that it wasn't found because 2F was never found, making this a sound file of something happening after Randus dies. If Petscop 19's description of Randus is anything to go by, in terms of the line, he does need water, but not as much as he thinks. This might be the sound of Randus being reborn, or maybe Randus realising he doesn't constantly need water to live. Or it could be literally anything else happening after Randus died, maybe a key or anything. So 2F and 30 are Randus's character arc. On to the next sound effects in SFX2. The first undiscovered file is sound file 43. This can either be one of two things. The obvious answer is the windmill disappear sound we hear preceding the ominous windmill sound, which is listed as sound file 44. But look at the sounds before 43. It's the cries of all the cares. Now listen to this. If the list is ordering sound files into certain themes, then it's likely that sound file 43 could be the cry of care in her egg form. But this would only make sense if sound file 44, named Windmill, is made up of both of these sound effects. But the idea that the windmill sounds would be part of the same file makes no sense really. So I'll make 43 the windmill disappear sound. Next we come to file 49. Easy enough. Petscop 7, it's the sound the game makes when you try to deposit an unfound character to the child library.
There's my work.
Now we have file 4A, unique as it is listed in Petscop 17, played in the soundtrack video, but not heard anywhere else in the game. The file is titled Leaving, and we know that this is 4A, because after that we have the wheel turn sound. If we look at it in context of its theme, it clearly has something to do with the child library. So once again, one of two things. Now these are just guesses, but it's either 1, you don't change your mind after 6 months and leave the child at the child library, at which point you hear, or 2, if being before the wheel turn in terms of the sound effects means anything, it's the sound that plays if you deposit your child in the wheel, but don't turn the wheel and just leave the room, implying you're not even trying to rebirth the child or give it a second chance, you're just abandoning it. I'm gonna go with... I don't know either, they're both guesses. We now come to 52 and 53. These are not heard or written, so they are left blank. For now, I'll come back to them later. Yes, 57 to 5C. From this, I figured that there are 2 sound effects that can be determined to be part of this part of the list. However, 4 of them are unknown. As we know, one of the sounds is the curse sound from Petscop 17. The other sound we hear before the recognisable sounds that follow it on this list, making it one of the sounds that can be placed as part of these 6 numbers. As we can see, the preceding sound effects are the sounds of the room impulse tool. If we are to remain thematic to Petscop 17, then I would say that number 57 should be the curse sound we hear during that episode. And you have to remember that Petscop 17 is viewed through the eyes of an administrator selecting and using recordings to find things within the game. And all of these sounds we hear are the sounds that are made with the impulse feature. That's why 58 is going to be this sound here. If 57 is the curse sound, then 58 would be the purify sound. I say purify just because it's the inverse of a curse and it has a heavenly tone about it. Yes, this is totally a guess, but an educated one. If there is a curse sound, there may be a sound for its inverse, if there is an inverse at all. Other than that, I have no idea what this sound could be. I'd still place it at 58, but I wouldn't be able to name it or describe it. That makes 59 to 5C unknown. Or does it? We now come to an anomaly, because we hear this. If this list is ordered the same way as the Petscop soundtrack, then this should be impossible. We have the calendar flip sound file, but then we have the Christmas TV zoom in. Does that mean that the zoom sound file is the Christmas TV zoom in sound? No, because if you listen to them in order after that, with their names apparent, then they're all off by 1 and the names don't really make sense. But there is one theory that rectifies this, and I believe this theory is correct. The calendar flip sound file is in fact the Christmas zoom in sound. I mean, in Petscop 11, Paul goes into the bathroom and the game does change the calendars on him. They flip it on him, you could say. Wait, so does that mean text appear 2 is the calendar date change sound file? No, that's still the harsher text sound. We hear text appear 1 earlier as the text twiddle that happens when a prompt is written. So text appear 2 would have to be the harsher caref twiddle from Petscop 14. Now remember when I told you about the OOC and Lost Music file debacle? Now's the time to explain. The reason I won't put the Lost as OOC is because the names don't match, simple as that. It doesn't make sense to change these 2 names. The closest we get to a name change between the 2 videos are the files Level 1 and Level 2. If you check the Petscop 17 video, you'll see the corresponding names for those files are Evencare, Level 1, and Workzone, Level 2. However, to me, this implies something else. Something that may have a deeper meaning in terms of story. But let's not get sidetracked. Anyway, Lost is its own file and we've yet to hear OOC, because Petscop has made no serious attempt at changing file names as of yet, and when it has, the previous file names, that were also music files as OOC and Lost are, have still in part retained their alternate names. Now back to text appear 2 not making sense in its turn order on the list. Much like Lost and OOC not being the same thing, this file is not going to be the date switch sound, as Tony wouldn't use pre-existing phrases such as text appear to describe anything other than text appearing. Now I know what you might be thinking. If it was text appear 2, why don't we hear it? Why was it omitted? But remember, we don't need to hear the text appear 2 sound because of the description recovered from a Tarnicot machine. A Tarnicot machine. Not Paul's Tarnicot machine, not the machine that was used in Petscop 17, a Tarnicot machine. We see 9 of what might be Tarnicot machines throughout the entire series, so this machine may have different sound files on it. some new, some missing. If my theory about why some sound files are missing is correct, then the new files we hear, as well as the ones that are missing during the Petscop soundtrack video, might be because an entirely different playthrough was done on that machine. That means if calendar flip is this sound, then any of these could be the date change sound file. In fact, if we're staying thematic, then the only logical place to insert the date change is here. Being able to place it here means we could start some sub-themes. Look at the theme from 4E to 64. Notice any similarities? They're all things that can happen in the house, divided into sub-themes. Into the missing files, we can incorporate house sound effects that aren't heard in the Petscop soundtrack video or listed in Petscop 17, but they are sounds we know exist as we hear them in other videos. Filling them in, they perfectly encapsulate the remaining missing sound files. In order, they are family murmurs, plate dinks, care is missing alarm, alarm defusal, and air conditioning destroyed. This could be reordered a bit, but it would still work fine. It wouldn't make much difference, as long as it made sense in terms of list order. And this also makes it possible for the calendar flip to actually be the Christmas zoom in sound, not the calendar date change. 63 is tough, and I can't find it, but I know where to find it. As you can see, the theme is the house during Petscop 14. Both the versions of the house during Petscop 14 are represented in this list. If we're looking for this sound, we have to look in the house during Petscop 14. 65 is the sound of the padlock on the locker during the school scenes. And represents the start of a new theme, the sounds of the school. This theme starts from 65 and goes to either 6A or 6B. 6C is listed as head button and described as the P2 to talk sound effect. But, as with earlier, just because it fits doesn't mean it makes sense. Remember the descriptors for everything else. Simple and to the point. Consider the context as well. P2 to talk. The file's probably called P2 to talk as well. So what is head button in this case? Well, it's not easy to hear, but before the P to talk sound effect, you hear very quickly the gamepad appear sound. So that would be 6A, and P to talk would be 6B. It's the only thing that would make sense in terms of list progression. And if 6A is the gamepad sound and 6B is P to talk, then this other sound is either 6D or 6C, the head button sound file. Which is great, because I got some speculation. What if this sound is the head button sound file? If, like I stated in my previous video Head Trauma, that a head is a designation of sorts that may change, the head button may be a sort of option that changes the head of the player character, or opens a head menu. I mean, it sounds like a menu opening sound. All of this is speculation, of course, but I'll name it that all the same because I thought of it first. This leaves 6D unknown. Finally, we come into the last stretch. From 71 to 83, we have 19 different files, and we have 15 different sounds from the soundtrack to match them up with. At this point in the list, exact placement doesn't really matter, so here they are as is, in order with names and descriptions where possible.
Uh-oh, bye-bye. And now,